Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise and Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Swithun, Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. And as a sort of segue from our last roundtable discussion, one thing that was brought up was that sort of dismantling and defunding the military-industrial complex would be the holy grail of U.S. Domestic policy. And also, given that it's likely Biden, if he does win the election, will continue the forever war, talking about this complex, this structure of globalism and the military-industrial complex, where it came from, and how it developed so where it is now, it would be a good place to start. And I know, Keith, you've got a lot to say about that. So, where did this whole system start? How did it grow?
Well, I guess the beginnings of it in its modern form start with the post-war era. It starts with the close of World War II. If we wanted to trace it back further, I suppose we could trace it back to the 19th century. Prior to the 19th century, you typically had a world order where you had various regional dynasties that had domain over their own particular realm. I mean, you did have, by that point, a lot of the European colonial empires were starting to get started that came out of the age of exploration, but you still had predominantly regionalized or localized dynasties and empires and powers that had their own spheres of influence in ways that did not necessarily intersect with each other in very significant ways. And then in the 19th century, during the liberal era, you start to see the Industrial Revolution, and you start to see the much wider expansion of trade routes and the building of these old liberal trade empires, for example, the British Empire and others. You saw the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. And then all that came to a head in World War I, where you had the various European empires that had a showdown with each other. And out of that, you had this aftermath where you had the League of Nations created, where there was this idea there was going to be this international community and that they were going to outlaw war and all of these kinds of things. And along with that, in individual countries, you started to see the replacement of traditional forms of government, monarchies and aristocracies and oligarchies with democratic republics. And a lot of those were not very successful. That's how we got Bolshevism and National Socialism and all of those things. And then, of course, there was World War II. And then after World War II, what was really left standing is that the American Empire and the Soviet Union and its satellites, because everything else had pretty much been wiped out in the war, or it really hadn't developed the level of industrial development necessary to maintain global power. So you had the United States step in and essentially assume control over what had been the colonial territories of the former European colonies. Most of the European states can no longer sustain their international empires. So the United States essentially inherited those and consolidated that into this world system, into this global system, this global liberal order. Of course, there was the Soviet Union that was always present, and that had to be contained, and that was what the Cold War was about. But other than the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, in the post-war period up through recently, what we've seen is this system of American dominance. That's why they call the 20th century the American century. You have this system of American dominance that more or less imposes this kind of liberal internationalist model on the entire world. And out of that, what we have seen since the end of the Cold War is we've seen the expansion of globalization and international trade, where previously the Soviet Union and its satellites were closed to the outside world, but now we've seen globalization expand into Russia and Eastern Europe and all the former communist countries, China and places like that as well. So we have this global system now, this global system of international trade that is largely kept in place through these international institutions like the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, all these kinds of things, International Monetary Fund, and the United States and by extension NATO and all of that is what really provides the military muscle that keeps all that together in case it prevents it from being challenged in any meaningful way. So that's the system that's been in place on some level since the end of World War II, and it's continued to expand where it's an almost universal system today. And the big question is going to be how sustainable is this going to be indefinitely, and what's going to replace it when it finally starts to recede.
Yeah, exactly. I think also, given the importance of the United States as a political entity in a country in this broader network, the sort of origins, what I would sort of identify would be in the 19th century after the U.S. Civil War, with the rise of the monopolistic corporations like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and the Fords. And these groups, because they were able in some sense to leverage the amendment that freed the slaves and against discrimination based on race and personhood, they were able to gain personhood status. And so these corporations now become essentially immortal persons with all the same legal rights as another person, except they don't die. And so they can continually acquire more and more assets and resources. And initially, they were trying to consolidate and get the resources in the North American continent, and in league with the U.S. government, which gave them more and more exemptions that were not given to other organizations. They amassed more and more power. And the real tipping point was 1913 when they brought the Federal Reserve Bank into existence, which allowed them to then take control of the financial monetary system in the United States. And at this point, the biggest problem for imperialism from the perspective of the United States was financing. Financing was very difficult to do. And so we didn't have a national bank from 1837 to 1913. And so without a national bank, it was very difficult to finance wars. So with the rise of the British Empire, the Bank of England, sometime I think it was the 1690s, was able to start financing many of these conflicts, which heretofore either the kings of England or the Parliament under Oliver Cromwell were just unable to finance. And so that had to be put into place for this to actually work. And so the next step was that they would then use their clout to create nonprofit foundations whereby they could influence cultural and political issues in the United States without being seen directly for who they are. Right? There's all these, essentially front groups that they operate behind, that they then give, legal immunities and benefits to then advance their agenda under the guise of philanthropy. And so at this point, they're consolidating. This is probably during, say 1890 to the World War I, the sort of progressive era, where they're also consolidating with the federal government in management styles with Taylorism. And then what you end up having is World War I is where they try to bring the United States out of its North American and Western Hemisphere focus to a more of a global focus. That doesn't work because ultimately the United States fails to join the League of Nations, and so they have to try for round two. And then round two is where they eventually get the United States involved in conflicts in World War II. And backing up to World War I, as Smedley Butler pointed out in War as a Racket, it was U.S. Financial and military aid to the Western Allies that created the ties that would eventually draw America into the broader conflict, which the Neutrality Acts, which were passed in the 1930s, attempted to short-circuit that. So basically, Roosevelt had to skillfully manipulate Japan into attacking the United States to then get the United States to go into the broader conflict. And at this point, with the rest of the world devastated by the end of the wars, you mentioned, Keith, the United States and these corporations were the only groups that were really left to impose any sort of order on the world. The only other great power that was still standing was the USSR, but again, it was devastated by the German invasion in World War II. And furthermore, previous Stalinist purges in the decades prior. And so they were then able to, again, extract vast sums of revenue from all of these nations they were rebuilding. And so this sort of mercantile elite is one element of all this. But then another element is the sort of technocratic elite, as we see the rise of research and development and scientific inquiry for the purposes of, military technology or more commercial services, especially in the post-war era. We have this almost, high priesthood caste of white lab coat scientists where, science is the means of truth and this arcane knowledge that most average plebs aren't able to understand. They can figure it out and we should listen to them. And of course, as was predicted by a wide slew of people ranging from the Unabomber to C.S. Lewis to the British General J.F.C. Fuller, this group is in some sense a sort of culture of death, which because it views the no impediment to its scientific progress. It's like, if we can do it, we will do it, no matter what the consequences are for the rest of humanity when it comes to these sort of developments. And of course, at the end of World War II, with the use of atomic bombs, a lot of people saw there was a lot more of awareness of just how stark this was. And once the Cold War ended, this technocratic elite was able to sort of weave this fairy tale that the internet would save us and free us, and that technology and transhumanism would liberate mankind, and then undo the negative propaganda of the post-war era with atomic bombs and poison gas and prison camps. And so this elite wants to use, as Bill Joy wrote in the 2000 article for Wired magazine, why the future certainly doesn't need us being the rich, powerful globalists, they want to create this sort of petri dish of humanity where they can just sort of observe and manipulate and tinker with to make man in their own image. And then, in fact, this goes back to the 1913 entry in the Rockefeller educational program for the Deep South, General Education Board 1913, where they said basically just that. And so I think these two elements sort of merged together, along with the entrenched military establishment that took over the policing of these colonial empires, to have like this almost like tripartite group of like state power via the armed forces, the scientific technocratic establishment, and then the sort of mercantile industrial establishment. Swithun, what are some of your thoughts?
I think your tripartite distinction is quite accurate as to how it currently operates. Going back to your central national bank point, people may or may not know this, but historically, as you pointed out, the reason Britain founded the Bank of England was to fund, I think it was the 9 Years' War. And Louis XIV, who's still, I think, holds the record for longest serving European monarch, not the founder, but the guy who made the Versailles Palace like incredible, and was sort of the paragon of absolute monarchism in the 17th and 18th century. He found it very difficult. In his early reign, he had quite a lot of wars, and he couldn't finance, and then he didn't pay the money back. And so for his later wars and his later part of his reign, he found it very difficult to finance them because the Paris brothers and other fanciers were going to charge him very high interest rates, and he envied the Dutch, because to my knowledge, the Dutch were the first created the first sort of national bank with the Bank of Amsterdam, which I think was like 20 or 30 years earlier than in England. But of course, we had the Glorious Revolution in 1688. You bring Billy Orange over, and then a lot of the Dutch mercantile ideas take hold in Britain. And then, of course, you can get the national bank. So that's just to reiterate the importance of the banking sector with the whole of this. Also with international, more currently of international American hegemony. You've got to remember after this Second World War, you have the Bretton Woods Agreement, whereby the dollar basically becomes the international currency because it's the only one which has a gold backing, and foreign central banks can redeem US dollars for gold there. And this was sort of like a patched up system of a quasi gold standard, which kind of ended in the First World War, and it was a return in some respects to that. And then, of course, when Nixon closed the gold window, the Americans become even more concerned about oil. And then, of course, you have the petrodollar system, which is still in place effectively, which allows far greater demand for the US dollar than otherwise would exist, which effectively means that they can print and not have as much inflation as they otherwise would have in those situations. With the sort of predominance of sort of global technocratic elites, one thing hasn't been mentioned so far, which is of particular importance to extending that, is the environmental movement, because that was one of the main causes, main justifications of sort of further international cooperation to deal with problems which could not be done on the national level. Maurice Strong, most in particular here at the United Nations. And you can see how this has, and then of course you have the Rio summit in 1992, I think, and then you get the worldwide coordination of environmental policy, which to a large extent just makes it more difficult for smaller players to operate, because the regulation is written in the interests of the large corporations. I mean, for instance, where lots of the national governments get their sort of regulation ideas from is from international corporation bodies who kind of get together and go, what do we think the regulation should be? Oh, I think this would be a good idea. And then it's sort of decided at this larger international level and then is implemented on a national one. And that feeds back into your, Todd, your point about the large corporations which sort of start to exist in sort of the late 19th century, the Rockefellers, etc. And then I think going forward as well, what we'll see now going into consolidate further international cooperation and coordination, which basically means you can't do anything that the global American system don't like, is going to be on health. It's going to be, well, we can't have all these pandemics taking place. What we need is international coordination, and we need to be watched and monitored in such a way that we will prevent these issues from becoming a large issue. And then you can see all the usual suspects are in support of certain like international vaccine passports, etc., which is all sort of part of sort of the technocratic element that you mentioned before. And just on a historical note, at least in England's point, I was talking to Sean Gabb about this, is that it is with the rise of the corporation, but he sees it's in England's ruling class moves away from the traditional landed aristocracy into the mid and late 19th century. And that's where you really get the professional classes turning up, which is sort of consistent with sort of Burnham's approach with the managerial revolution. And those are the types of people who will try and treat people as if they were machines and be able to tinker. And then, of course, you get transhumanism, etc., which makes sense. Whereas you wouldn't do with the traditional landed aristocracy, who would basically have seen the lower classes as plebs who could have needed a little help. But, they weren't people who were going to sort of have a blank slate view of humanity. So I think going forward, international sort of cooperation, etc., from sort of managerial perspective is only going to get greater, and sort of having a diversity, as it were, within the system is going to be more difficult. Although that said, you've got a bigger counterweight with China, but to what extent the Chinese approach these days is distinct really from the US is only really in degree rather than kind, unlike, say, the Soviet Union and the US. So those would be my sort of historical and sort of future thoughts, as it were.
Yeah, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, my understanding of neoliberalism is that it began as something almost entirely economic on paper, something that was commensurate with theories of F.A. Hayek and this building up of privatized markets and big business creating various early monopolies on certain goods on a global level and so forth. What became popularly associated with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and this sort of 80s version of the European Union certainly had its origins in British and American international business in the 1800s. As Keith was pointing out earlier, whatever American and British businesses that had started out as purely sort of as a national entity could no longer sort of resist the temptations of global expansion, and therefore, as a way to maintain this sort of proto-global hegemony, big politics became involved in the safeguarding of this this economic world order type of a thing. And as Todd was touching on, America was brought into World War II in part due to its globalistic business structures and ties to other nations. The monarchism of the kind that the world witnessed in places like Franco Spain and these sort of past affinities for Napoleonic types of nationalism would definitely be swept away and traded out for something to be, ignored in place of international banking and business. When you discuss neoliberal expansion of the 20th century, there's also a corresponding rise of multinational corporations that primarily finance these global economic hegemonies, and also a rise in unionism with the European continent and more countries that are smaller in scale, sort of consolidating their power to form sort of a quasi-regional power, if you will. Kind of thinking in terms of almost like a global geostrategist here, but and one could at this point, with given the amount of privatization in the Chinese economy and just kind of the way that trend is going, one could think of China as sort of a global neoliberal power as well, although with a completely different aesthetic presentation and sort of, saying one thing to their public and then doing something else otherwise behind closed doors in terms of world economics. One might say that, just in terms of philosophy that came out of neoliberalism, one might say that Francis Fukuyama is one of the academic mascots for this sort of global hegemony, in the sense that he, the Cliff Notes summary on that is that, Francis Fukuyama believed that, liberal democracy coupled with a type of capitalism is sort of the end of history. And that's the sort of apotheosis of human history and civilizational development. So, and, of course, he was wrong just by just given the amount of wars that came up after he had written that, and also a lot of issues in sort of these privatized sectors and sort of a lot, basically just hoarding vast amounts of wealth and just a lot of wealth income inequalities and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's absolutely true to say that neoliberalism has its historical origins in sort of these British and American global business efforts. You could even perhaps make the argument that I'm so sorry, what was the name of the British shipping company of the 17 and 1800s? I forget the name of it, but you could argue that that was sort of one of the critical proto elements of the neoliberal hegemony.
One aspect is how they maintain authority in the regions they already exist in. So if we sort of look at this tripartite distinction in the United States, one of the ways that the military-industrial complex, the political element, maintains its influence is by, even though it goes against the sort of logic of economics to centralize production in a few areas for the sake of maximum efficiency, they spread the production all over the country so that every state has constituents who need jobs from the U.S. military-industrial complex. So whether you're a Democratic senator or a Republican senator, you're going to want to keep those jobs there. Otherwise, your constituents might vote you out of office. And so while it's technically not economically the most efficient, it's politically efficient. And that's a huge way they've been able to do that. And second of all, in conjunction with the mainstream news, which again is what's more surprising is not that a lot of like 20 somethings are now okay with the forever war, even though they might not have been, during Obama. What's really, I think, incredible is how the mainstream media has been able to get longtime left-wing anti-globalists who've been around since the 70s to support the forever war by supporting Biden. That I think is really the incredible thing here. And so I think also it might seem, simple and unimaginative, but I do think that since the 1980s, via Hollywood and television, there's been a lot of good press for the military. You think of like any like superhero movie, like the military, like the good guy backup, whether it's Transformers or Superman or any other sort of show. There's very few shows anymore or movies that portray the Army or the U.S. military in general in a very negative light. And I think a combination of all these forces help maintain that wing. And so, for example, if you look at like Pew, they'll say that the most popular U.S. institution is the U.S. military. Even today, after 20 years of a train wreck policy in the Middle East, it's still the most popular, more than the police, obviously, but even more than Congress, more than the U.S. Media system. And the other element, say the financial system, the way that they keep control is by incentivizing people to get into debt. And once you have a bunch of people in debt and you're the one that's issuing the credit and holding them accountable, to quote the Solomon, the debtor is slave to the lender. And so they get all these people in these webs of debt and obligations that they can't get out of. And they don't get into debt most of the time because of any sort of crisis in their lives. It's because they spend it on consumer spending, consumer debt. And I remember, I don't think it was Peter Schiff. I think it was his dad. He wrote a book about like a desert, sort of Robinson Crusoe story about how economics develops. And he had a chapter in that book where he's like, don't get into consumer spending debt because that's bad debt. You're not going to recoup that. Whereas if you get into debt to buy capital goods, then you could theoretically recoup that later. But so these people are just completely indebted and unable to get out of the hole they dug themselves into. So that the banks have this like chokehold on everybody. And I guess thirdly, with especially now with the internet and social media, as the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard pointed out, once you have this like parallel alternate reality that seems more real than the real, people get lost in it. And in part, it's being lost in this alternate reality that prevents them from actually dealing with the issues of the day, and also allows the elites to frame reality. So right, half the population thinks Trump got to be president because Russia interfered in the elections, and he's a fascist. Both of which are patently absurd claims, but it's because people live in this digital reality created by the technicians, the scientists. They have this level of control. Now, this level of control is, of course, predicted by Huxley and H.G. Wells in works they published in the 30s and 40s. But I think if we look at these as a sort of ensemble of control measures, it gives them this iron grip on not only the United States, but other nations in which they have already established themselves. Keith Preston, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would really disagree with any of that. When we look at, I think we're really talking about several different things here. One is the actual global system itself and how that functions as a set of institutional apparatuses. And we're also talking about the economic and technological, the wider material infrastructure behind that. And then we're also talking about its cultural foundation. And of course, all of these things intersect with each other and interconnect with each other. But what I think is interesting, though, is to consider the ways in which it seems to be falling apart. The United States internally isn't progressing. I mean, we can't really say, well, the United States is getting better and better over time. Maybe in some ways, but not in most ways, apparently not. One of the main indicators that social scientists use to measure the quality of life in a particular society is life expectancy. And life expectancy is declining in the United States. When you have a society where life expectancy is declining, it's a problem. That shows that there's a lot of things that are wrong in terms of health and many other things. All the basic measures of the quality of life. So we do see the United States declining internally in a lot of ways, in terms of health, in terms of disparities between rich and poor, in terms of social cohesion and rising social conflict. There seems to be a lot of people who are personally very dysfunctional on a lot of different levels. We also see, even though a record high number of people now have college degrees, it's like people are getting dumber and dumber in many ways. And so that none of that speaks well of the future of the United States. Now the question is, can a society that is deteriorating on the interior level continue to maintain some kind of global hegemony? And I tend to think that's very difficult. It's very difficult to have a crumbling internal society that maintains a large-scale international hegemony. I don't know of many historical precedents for that, at least none that were durable over a lengthy period of time. Maybe Rome during its latter period, I don't know. But it seems like internally the United States is becoming more and more like a Latin American country. I mean, and I'm not talking just about demographic change. I'm talking about institutional structures in terms of corruption and in terms of levels of violence and disorder and crime and wealth disparities and things like that. We see that happening. And so I think as the United States continues to crumble on an internal basis, we're going to see an American retreat from the world. And recently, I've seen a number of geopolitical analysts, people like Peter Zion and like Trine Flockhart, who have talked about what is going to replace this kind of global liberal order that American power has really kept in position since the end of World War II. And they have interesting theories of that on their own, in terms of what countries are going to be the most hegemonic, in a post-American world order and all of that. But one thing they seem to lean towards, a lot of the thinkers in this model, is that we're headed more towards a multi-order order. And that is, we're not just headed towards multipolarity, where we have the same neoliberal global order, but where the Chinese and the Russians, say, have more influence, or the EU plays a bigger role or something like that. And it's not necessarily that we're headed towards an actual world government or something, this kind of cosmopolitan system of rule by the UN or whatever, community of nations. Instead, it seems like we're moving very slowly towards something like what we saw in the pre-World War I era, or even in the pre-liberal era, which is something where you had regional powers with their own spheres of influence that were not necessarily connected to each other, except in fairly superficial ways. I mean, yeah, they may have engaged in some trade with each other and things like that, but they didn't really have a lot of institutional relationships. For instance, if you look at the world order of say, the mid-1700s, you see, well, you had the rising British Empire, the other European powers had their own various colonial possessions and all of that. You had the Ottomans, you had the Russian Empire, you had whatever was going on in China and all that, but you didn't really see this any kind of globalized system. And in fact, there were still a lot of places at that point that were inhabited largely by indigenous people and hunter-gatherer people, and a lot of frontier societies still left. Now, obviously, there's no more frontier societies left to go to unless we want to count space or seasteads on the ocean or something like that. But it does seem that we're moving more towards a more multi-order system, in a sense where in the future we're not going to have this universal system, like where we have this kind of universally or quasi-universally recognized system of international law and the UN and all that kind of stuff, or even these global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. For instance, China now is trying to create a competitor to some of these Western-dominated international financial systems. And then you also see China putting together its own trade systems, trade agreements throughout the world, even in the Western Hemisphere in Latin America. And then you see a reassertive Turkey. You see that Turkey is essentially trying to reclaim the Ottoman Empire. I mean, that's pretty obvious if you look at Turkey's overall geopolitical strategy. And of course, you see Putin trying to rebuild the old pre-Bolshevik Russian Empire, and you have all of these things going on at once. And it seems like within that framework that's developing there's going to be a system that of the type that existed prior to the 20th century or even prior to the 19th century, where you had these regional powers with their own spheres of influence, their own satellites, their own colonies, their own allies. And while I imagine there would still be more exchange and interaction than there was in the say the 19th century, because of the level of technological development that exists now, and transportation systems and all that. So I don't think globalization is going away completely, but I do see a more multi-order type of globalization emerging.
Yeah, Swithun, some of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it is certainly true that the sort of international institutions, let's say like the EU, which you could see to some extent as a satellite of the US in Europe, despite the protestations of the French, it, to a large extent is. These international organizations do not have the same cachet as they once did. Some had commented with respect to the coronavirus stuff is that it actually showed that the international institutions were of little value because everything was done basically on a national level. All the decisions on the EU basis, it was all taken on an individual country basis. There was no direct coordination on the sort of EU level. That said, of course, most of the responses were basically the same. So what explains that? I think we've gone over in other episodes. But even in the case of sort of less obviously formal cooperation, the cooperation is still here. I think as well that large corporations will want to try to maintain the current economic order to a large extent, even if it changes master, even if it were to be sort of more controlled by the Chinese and less controlled by the Americans. They will want to maintain this current system because standardization around the world, even though it increases costs for domestic trade, it reduces costs for international trade, in which they are significant beneficiaries of. So we'll want to try to maintain that. So at least as yet, I'm not convinced that we're going to get a multi-order order at least certainly not in the short term. Medium term, I'm still slightly agnostic on that, whilst recognizing, of course, that the US is effectively in decline. I mean, that's obviously the case. But it took the Roman Empire a long time to die. It could well be the same with the American. So despite it not being in the best of health, I think its demise will be slow, and any rise of other orders will take some time. And as of yet, there isn't really an obvious, well, apart from China, an obvious direct opponent for the Americans. On to the point you said, Todd, with respect to how well the American military is portrayed. I'm pretty sure the American military funds quite a lot of films, at least maybe not directly in all cases, but certainly indirectly. And then, of course, they have sort of co-opted the NFL so that the lots of the sports are sort of militarily sort of related, which of course is good PR for the military. You also say that the police have a pretty bad reputation, and I think that's true to a large extent. But think about the media sector. Lots of police procedurals pretty much always show the police as good overall. I mean, there might be individual actors who are nefarious and aren't operating by the rules, as it were. But the media does a very good job of legitimizing the current ruling class, and I see that continuing. As an aside, we seem to be seeing a greater centralization of the internet, etc., and any sort of alternative media, etc., are becoming increasingly more difficult to find. Now, there are ways around that, but I think the American empire is going to be around for quite a long time yet.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Yeah, that's a fairly interesting point that you made, Keith, in terms of sort of the possibility of a neoliberal global hegemonies operating at once. Yeah, just in terms, if you were to kind of take a big step back and look at the grander picture, what one can probably see as a possibility is a sort of Eurasian neoliberal structure with China sort of leading the charge with an India and a Russia sort of in partnership with something like that versus a British American sort of Western European Atlantic neoliberal structure, and both systems of which can have interests in places like Africa and the Middle East, South America, so on and so forth. One thing that's fairly well known at this point is a lot of Chinese infrastructural investment in Africa. So, building things like dams and electrical grids and plumbing networks and so on and so forth. So it would be interesting to see what the motive is for China for things like that in the long term. In terms of sort of like cultural perceptions of neoliberalism as well, it's difficult to find anyone who's using neoliberalism as sort of a compliment. I mean, really, it's just basically it's kind of a diss at this point. I mean, if you spend any amount of time in left-wing or right-wing dissident circles, or anyone that's sort of politically jaded at this point that doesn't really know where they're at, well, the disdain is really kind of headed in almost one direction towards a lot of these, Hillary Clinton, Bush types, and, who appear to have, an international interest first, and then everything else that comes in second. And so, with this, what will probably be the presumptive election of Joe Biden, I mean, it wouldn't be, I mean, not that I'm some sort of doomsayer type of a thing, but it wouldn't terribly surprise me if things escalated once again in places like Syria, or things got bad or worse with Iran, not because Joe Biden is this or that type of a person, but he and people like him have had the political careers of which they're beholden to these large multinational entities, multinational corporations and things like APAC and so on and so forth. So Swithun had a good point too. I mean, although we're kind of wounded, America is kind of internally really struggling, as you mentioned, with the decreasing of life expectancy. And Pew Research does of course its polls in various countries, rating the happiness of a lot of these places, and America is definitely not the happiest nation on earth. And so, one might wonder where this is all headed, but I think Swithun's right that I think the American international sort of business empire is certainly here to stay. But if things were to get bad at home initially, I wonder what the retraction of American global influence would look like. But in place of that, it looks like China, despite a lot of currency issues and market issues, is sort of trying to poise itself as sort of the new sort of a global economic and sort of global economic hegemony, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. The probably the most likely stumbling block that would either accelerate or facilitate this malaise in the system is further adventures in the Middle East. I mean, one would shudder at an actual U.S. invasion of Syria and Iran. Obviously under Trump, that's not likely going to happen, but in a successor to Trump, that seems to be possible. That seems to be what they want. Something like one or the other, or both. And there's this cycle where on the one hand they need to the United States Armed Forces needs to play the sort of world policeman mentality in order to keep the supply of goods traveling. Obviously, going back to your point, Keith, in the 18th century, most international trade routes were controlled by pirates. You had pirates operating off the coasts. You had over inland traffic, bandits and outlaws. And so that might be individuals, non-state actors, or it might actually be state actors. Like, for example, the Barbary pirates were quote unquote state actors. And some of the, maybe more Caribbean pirates were not so much state actors. But this presence is necessary to ensure that this transfer of goods and services continues. But as we see with previous orders like this, what ends up happening is the costs of maintaining the security outstrip the amount of revenue that can be generated by either taxing or incorporating this trade into the pocket of the nation. And furthermore, the other thing that we see is that the wealthy interests in whose this order is run create all these imaginative loopholes to avoid not having to pay into it. And that's exactly why the Roman Empire fell in the West in the 5th century, and the Eastern Roman Empire fell in the 15th century, is in large part these interests that they were serving, these large financial interests, refused to pay taxes, refused to pay funds directly to the state, which was acting on their behalf. And so they kind of hollowed it out. Now, during the 5th century, a lot of these local lords created the foundations of what would later become feudalism, where they would have their own local protection. But it was a poor substitute for the Roman legions that ended up not being paid. And so that seems to be a problem that is developing. Is, Peter Schiff in Occupy Wall Street would go around telling people, you talk about when Bill Clinton had these really high taxes on the wealthy. He said we weren't paying those taxes. We had loopholes to get out of that. And so part of the problem is these liberals think that, oh yeah, just raise taxes on the rich and they'll pay it. No, they won't. They'll just shift it to someone else. And so that, coupled with the increasing danger of imperial overreach, right? So for example, you have to keep on invading these countries, destabilizing these countries in order to ensure that they don't challenge your supremacy. But eventually you can only play that game for so long. And as we saw with the British Empire, and then before then the Roman Empire, you eventually pick fights either you can't win, or if you do win, they're essentially Pyrrhic victories. And so I think that on the foreign policy front is most likely where this is going to break down in the near future, if it does. So what would you say, Keith, for your final statement here?
Well, among people who observe international relations, there's different schools of thoughts on some of these things about the sustainability of the American empire. Noam Chomsky argues that the United States is still way, way, way on top, and that is going along, it has not nearly reached its peak in terms of durability or sustainability. And I think there's some truth to that, because if we see the problems that the United States has today, the problems internally in the United States could still be a lot worse before the United States would even begin to approximate, let's say, some of the third world countries or lesser developed countries look like, or even countries that are considered upper middle income. Like internationally, the United States is considered an upper income country, but Mexico is actually considered an upper middle income country. So the United States has a long way to go before it's even as in bad a shape as Mexico, much less say, Central Africa or something like that. So I do think that some context is required there. But it's also true that the United States is in a unique position of having this unprecedented global hegemony. So the United States isn't just any country. It's it's not just any government. It's really the de facto world government, or it's the senior partner in a de facto world government. So I do think that given that level of hegemony that the U.S. has, I do think that is going to be increasingly unsustainable over time, because for one thing, it's losing its legitimacy domestically. I mean, nobody in the United States really cares about foreign policy in the sense of the anti-war movement or anything like that. But then they don't really care about foreign policy, period. I mean, it seems to be an issue that's very far down on the list in terms of public interest, and except for fears of terrorism or something like that. But other than just very generic things like that, it doesn't seem to be much of an issue. And as the United States continues to deteriorate domestically, I think we're going to see more and more people focused inward and thinking about domestic issues and not international issues. Of course, as was said before by terminal philosophy, the elite seem to care primarily about international issues. Because if you look at the things that the power elite in the United States agree on, the first thing they always agree on is foreign policy. They pretty much have the same basic views of Syria and Iran and in Saudi Arabia and Israel and U.S.-China relations. I mean, yeah, there's differences in the details and who should we attack first and that kind of stuff. But it's kind of like what you see in the right-wing Israeli press. Like, well, who should we bomb first? Well, maybe it should be Gaza. No, maybe it should be Lebanon. No, maybe it should be Syria. That's kind of what the American press looks like on a more general level. That is the one thing they seem to agree on. And and I think that shows increasingly that elites and the general public are becoming increasingly opposed to each other and polarized as well. In addition to the wider polarization you have between all the different political tribes in the United States. And when you have a society that's becoming more and more fractious in that way and more polarized socioeconomically, politically, culturally, it does seem like it's going to be difficult to create any kind of consensus for maintaining international power. And I think some people among the elite recognize this on some level. I think that on one hand, you have people like, say, John Kerry or some of the people that were in the Obama administration that seem to have the idea that, well, the United States needs to rely more on its partners, what they call partners, meaning junior partners like, the major UN countries and the EU countries and the NATO countries and things like that, this kind of multi-partner system. And you've got even further to the left than that, you've got someone like Bernie Sanders, who has this idea of like some kind of cosmopolitan community of nations, which would basically be, it's basically a regurgitation of the League of Nations idea, and then you have the realists. You have these neo-realists who on one hand seem to favor a kind of American unilateralism. They're kind of like the neocons in that sense, although they're not aggressively militarist in the same way as the neocons. They think that's not practical and not sustainable over a long period of time. I guess they're more like sane unilateralists as opposed to insane unilateralists. So those seem to be the major policy debates that are going on among the ranks of the elite in terms of the future of the American empire, and they're all worried about the rise of multipolarity that China and Russia and places like that could theoretically pose a counter hegemon to American power. Russia was mentioned earlier in the conversation. Of course, you've got someone like Alexander Dugin, the one who envisions this idea of instead of having a Pax Americana, it's going to be a Pax Russian Empire, the Third Rome or whatever, or like this kind of Eurasian alliance with Russia sort of as the centerpiece of it. I guess with China being the economic arm and Russia being the military arm or something like that. And I could see that emerging on some basic level, although I do think it would be difficult for all of the Eurasian countries to keep it together into some kind of structured alliance, because given their history of conflict with each other, that's one issue. I think the one thing that unites them is their opposition to American hegemony. But we do see in different places, we do see different powers becoming more assertive on their own. I do think Turkey, the way that Turkey seems to be a rising power, is particularly interesting. I mean, given that the Ottomans were dominant in that region for centuries, and something like 700 years, and now a century after the decline of the Ottoman Empire, it seems like the Erdogan's really struggling to bring it back. I do think that's interesting, and also the ongoing conflict between the Sunni Shia axis in the Middle East. I'm curious to see how that would play out, once the American hegemony starts to pull back from that particular region, which I suspect it will, at least in the long run, as it becomes less sustainable.
Okay, Swithun, final thoughts.
I think I agree with you, Todd, that the undoing of the American empire will be trying to maintain its overseas military arm, just because of how darn expensive it is. And that will eventually become rather expensive to maintain. I think that probably depends to a large extent on how on the petrodollar continues, which is actually interesting insofar as everyone's trying to get things electrified and how that will make a difference. Although I don't see oil becoming particularly unimportant anytime soon. So I do think that would be an issue, and I think they will continue the military escapades, not necessarily for defending the trade routes. I don't see why that would necessarily require foreign invasion rather than just a few boats defending a particular route. I don't see why that would necessarily be the case. But it just certainly be the true that lots of the military contractors want lots of wars so they can sell weapons to the US government, because effectively Lockheed Martin, etc., are basically arms of the Defense Department. And I see that they will continue to want to get their contracts, and so that will continue to take place. And again, yes, they will try to avoid paying as much tax as possible for paying for the privilege of being able to fund more, provide weapons for more wars. So I do think the military overreach is probably eventually going to be the Achilles heel, but they will be able to maintain that as long as the dollar is hegemonic. The question is whether it will, because that was one of the theories as to why they invaded Iraq, was because Saddam wanted to trade oil in euros, which would then potentially start a domino and therefore reduce the demand for the dollar and thus the power of the Federal Reserve. So I think military and central banking is the key for how long the American
All right, terminal philosophy, final thoughts.
Right. Well, I'm pretty much in agreement with everyone here. I think, with the American neoliberal hegemony, if some of these sort of decaying domestic issues aren't addressed with some degree of, timeliness, with, just a lot of institutions in the United States and the sort of, there's sort of this psychological civilizational malaise going on with America and the West too, which, is just sort of commensurate with this declining quality of life and life expectancy and so on and so forth. If these expensive wars in the Middle East, as well as these really expensive and arguably outdated social safety net systems, aren't addressed with some degree of care, well, then these internationalists that are running the show from American and British business perspective will have, they'll have a two-front war on where they're still trying to compete internationally, and then they've got all these big domestic issues at home. I think if they want any future in maintaining some sort of global hegemony, then they'll have to, satisfy a number of things on the home front. But we can see that, in U.S. politics, if anything, one could argue that that's a window into the elites trying to maintain both. I think, 21st century neoliberalism will add certainly an interesting chapter in the larger conversation of elite theory and just how these overlapping complex systems will interact with each other. But again, I think if domestic issues aren't addressed, well, then we will see a retraction of America internationally. I think I'll keep it at that.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. It's a great stream as always. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.